We will, no, she's going to stand up and talk there. Okay.
No, I think I'll just do that one.
Okay, great.
Hi, nice to meet you.
He works with Tim. He's a wizard with all things government paperwork. I admire so much.
Good bureaucrat.
I'm sure it'll come in handy.
She'll be here late, I'm sure. Right time. Okay, I'm going to start. Oh, okay.
Oh, and thank you too. Okay.
And he bought a
You
book.
bought my book.
Good afternoon. Welcome to the Woodrow Wilson Center. I have a feeling that some people, that when they left their offices and they're out in that beautiful sunshiny day, like, oh, I have to want to hear about the book launch, but boy, it's really nice outside. So I'm sure we're going to get a few more people walking in as it talks. So probably, I mean, you're great, but the sun's wonderful too. Yeah, on behalf.
I hired you for this job.
Hey, on behalf of the Wilson Center's Asia program and the China Environment Forum and the Council on Foreign Relations, I want to welcome you here today to a book launch for Liz Economy. The book is called A River Runs Black: The Environmental Challenge to China's Future. Before we get into before I introduce Liz, I did want to say for some of the folks who might be new coming to the Wilson Center, the Wilson Center was created in 1968 by Congress as a memorial to our 28th president, who was a scholar and a policymaker, notably our only PhD president. And to memorialize him, we created this kind of living forum of policy dialogue. We have about 13 programs and projects that focus on different regions or topics, bringing together diverse groups from government, NGO, business, and academia, all focusing on foreign policy. I coordinate the China Environment Forum, which has been here since 1997. And I didn't start till 1999. And the reason I bring this up is that Liz Economy, under my predecessor, she would come and co-chair all of the meetings. And it's really her fault, probably, that the network that I inherited grew so large. And, so you're kind of like, I don't know, did we say godmother of the project? But no, but she did a lot to help this project get off the ground in 97 until I came, I came in 98 and just took over, and it's been a really fun job. I put on a lot of meetings and put out publications on all things China environment and energy issues, working with Chinese NGOs, government, and all the folks in the U.S. who work on China. And I actually think this is my first book launch. And it's a special one because, Liz is, she's a friend and also someone that I greatly respect for her work and writing on China politics and environment. Liz is the CV Star Senior Fellow and Director of Asia Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations. She's published widely on Chinese domestic and foreign policy, and as you know today, her book is on China environment. In fact, many of her books and articles have focused on environmental issues in China and, and also U.S.-China relations linked to that. And I do have to say that, I edit a publication here, and so I'm a very picky editor, and I've been reading this book, and it's written really well. I mean, it's depressing, a lot of the information, but it's very eloquently put, and I think that obviously I'm pushing. Go buy a copy when you're done today. In addition to writing and her work at Council on Foreign Relations. She also teaches courses at Johns Hopkins Paul H. Nietzsche School of Advanced International Studies, and she serves on various China boards like the China-U.S. Center for Sustainable Development, and she frequently consults for the U.S. government. I'm going to stop because you came to hear her, so I'd like to invite Liz to tell us about her book. Let's welcome Liz.
Thank you, Jennifer, for that really lovely introduction. I should correct, however, that I don't teach at SICE anymore. I did teach previously. I taught at Columbia last semester. It's sort of on and off. But thank you. And it really is a privilege, an honor, and a real pleasure to be here. Not only because, as Jennifer said, I have a little bit of history with the center, but also because Jennifer is so terrific and has done just an amazing job with the China program, China Environment Program here. And for those of you who are not yet engaged in the meetings that she runs and all the work that she does, I would strongly encourage you to become engaged because you will find it well worth your time. What I'd like to do for the next 30 minutes or so, which is the amount of time that Jennifer has allotted me to introduce my book, is really just to share some of the findings, some of the key findings from the book. And then I'll be happy to take your questions and comments. 10 years ago, the Huai River Valley, which is a fertile and prosperous region on China's eastern seaboard, suffered a major pollution disaster. A number of factories dumped a toxic mix of pollutants into the Huai, turning the water black, devastating fisheries, ruining crops, and causing thousands of people to become ill. This was only the latest in a series of pollution disasters that had plagued the river for more than 2 decades. But for the first time, Beijing intervened in a serious manner and called for a 2-stage campaign. First, to halt all industrial waste pollution by 1997, and second, to have the river run clear by the year 2000. The campaign targeted the thousands of small-scale township and village enterprises that had sprung up primarily during the reform period, but also before, along the banks of the river and its tributaries, and called upon local officials either to have those enterprises meet pollution standards or to close them down. Local officials were also supposed to build 52 wastewater treatment plants. In January 2001, at the conclusion of the campaign, the State Environmental Protection Administrator, Xie Zhenhua, stepped up and declared the campaign a success, and said that 70% of the water along the Huai was now suitable for fishing, and 70% of the water in the tributaries was suitable for agriculture or industry. The People's Daily proclaimed that what it had taken the West decades to accomplish, China had managed to do in only a few years. There was only one problem. This wasn't really true. In the aftermath of Xie's statement, a scientist from Anhui, Su Kaixing, decided to check the water quality. He found that, in fact, the level of pollutants was double the government's targets, and that in Anhui, his own province, the water quality was grade 5, unsuitable even for irrigation. He also pointed out that instead of the 52 wastewater treatment plants along the river, there were only 6. And of course, hundreds, if not thousands, of enterprises that were supposed to be shut down were not. The Workers' Daily and the Shanghai People's Daily publicly supported Su. And indeed, the following summer, his assessment was borne out when there was yet another pollution disaster. Today, the State Environmental Protection Administration acknowledges that the water quality on the Huai has continued to deteriorate to the point that at the 3 major monitoring stations, the water quality is grade 4 or 5, which again means suitable only for agriculture or in some cases just industry. Cleanup costs are estimated at about $100 billion US. I tell this story in a somewhat extended fashion at the outset of my book because I think that it illustrates fairly clearly a number of the things that are most important to understand about the nature of China's environmental challenge. First, that China's environmental challenges are not merely a function of the rapid economic growth of the past few decades, but in many instances have resulted from many more decades, if not centuries, of abuse. Second, that Beijing often relies on high-profile campaigns to solve large-scale environmental problems to very little effect. They don't engage local officials and scientists, don't provide the necessary resources, and don't provide appropriate follow-through. Third, and perhaps not too surprisingly, local officials, when confronted with the choice of continuing economic development and maintaining social stability, or shutting down enterprises and facing the prospect of social instability from laid-off workers, really don't consider it much of a choice at all. Fourth, China's environmental practices have ramifications for a wide range of social issues, such as public health and economic productivity. And finally, much of the burden and the opportunity for environmental protection today rests with civil society and individuals such as Sue. This has enormous implications, I think, not only for environmental protection, but also for broader political reform in China. And what I'd like to do now is simply to talk a little bit more about what I found during my research with regard to each of these challenges. First, today's crisis is not simply a crisis born of the past 20 years. Rather, centuries of war, economic development, and population pressures have all taken their toll. As many of you here know, war was a constant fixture of Chinese life. For the environment, this meant that mountains and grasslands were exploited for ores to produce spears and cannons and armor. There was rampant deforestation for fuel, and this doesn't even include the toll that war itself took on the environment. Second, and one thing that I learned from this research that I really hadn't known, was that China has long experienced population pressures on the land. The vast majority of Chinese leaders throughout history have believed that a large population was necessary, not only to provide a strong army, but also for taxes. This wasn't simply a function of Mao Zedong's views on population growth. So that you had reports of population pressures on the land as early as the Tang Dynasty, 618 to 906 AD. And by 1403, China already had 100 million people, or a quarter of the world's population. Economic development also took its toll on the environment. During the early Qing, for example, there were periods of very rapid economic growth. Entire areas in northern China were transformed into desert because of land reclamation. For agriculture, there was widespread soil erosion, polluted groundwater. There were even local protests over pollution from factories. And there were reports of lakes where fish had once been plentiful and no longer existed. Of course, under Mao, such environmental degradation and pollution only intensified. And for those of you who are particularly interested in this period of time, I would commend to you Judith Shapiro's book, Mao's War Against Nature, really a wonderful examination of this particular period. And as she details, grain campaigns, Mao's grain campaigns, The Great Leap Forward, caused massive deforestation. Lakes were filled. And certainly during the Great Leap Forward, you saw this very rapid increase also in industrial pollution. Just during this period of time, China gained 600,000 iron and steel furnaces, 59,000 coal mines, and 900 cement factories in just a span of about 3 years. This is not to say, however, that the problems that China confronts today are stem primarily from practices of the Mao period or before. The skyrocketing economic development that China has experienced during the reform period for the past 25 years or so has produced a staggering number of new problems and merely compounded the old. Just to give you a couple of statistics, which are in the book, in terms of air pollution, most recent figures suggest that China has about 16 of the 20 most polluted cities in the world. Of course, much of this is derived from China's reliance on coal for about 70% of its energy. And this compares, just to give you some reference, with about 17% for Japan, about 50% for India. China is the world's largest consumer of coal. And despite a lot of rhetoric about reorienting the energy mix in China, you can see that just the pace and the drive for economic development has made this virtually impossible. And in fact, over the past year, coal consumption actually increased from 1.37 billion tons to 1.58. There's also the problem that industry is relatively inefficient compared to that of the developed countries. And now for any of you who have visited China in the recent past, you'll see that China is confronting yet another problem, and that is the growing automobile use. Beijing has 2 million cars today. By the end of this year, expectations are that Beijing will have 3 million cars, and China is expected to have the second largest car market in the world by 2013. Just to give you a sense for what that means, there was a study done a few years ago that said the average life expectancy for a traffic cop in Beijing was 40 years. And I have to say, just having been there 2 weeks ago, that I thought the pollution was as bad as I had seen it. And this is despite a concentrated effort right now to improve the air quality for the upcoming Olympics. But I think if you were to ask Chinese leaders what the most serious environmental problem that they face is, they would probably say it's water. And about 60 million people find it difficult to get access to enough water for their daily needs. About 10 times that many drink contaminated water on a daily basis. Demand has been growing at roughly 5% per year for industry, and more than that for municipalities. As you can imagine, as the economy grows, so too does demand for water. As people grow wealthier, they want to take showers, have washing machines, dishwashers, etc. All these things demand water. You may have seen recent press reports, in fact, that talk about the overpumping of groundwater leading to sinking of China's land, and now people in the coastal areas some people in the coastal areas are being forced to relocate because their homes are below the water level. Finally, just to mention, land degradation, of course, is an enormous problem. China is already 1/4 desert, and this is expanding at a rate of about 900 square miles per year. A few years back, Premier Zhu Rongji supposedly said that China ought to consider moving the capital from Beijing someplace further south because of the encroaching desert, although scientists have said that's probably not necessary. But the point really is just to say that on every front, the environment in China is under stress. One of the other things that I found as I was doing my research is that there are a lot of ripple effects from China's environmental challenges, and there's interplay with other domestic issues. For example, with the economy. The World Bank in the sort of mid to late 1990s, about 1997, produced a report whose findings were really confirmed by other Chinese analysts as well as some other Western analysts, that environmental pollution and degradation in China cost China the equivalent of 8 to 12% of GDP annually. And this comes from things like lost days of work when people are ill because of respiratory disease from pollution, or factories can't operate because there are water shortages, or crops are ruined from polluted water. And just to give you a couple of the figures, to give you sort of a better sense, this past year they estimated that acid rain cost the Chinese $13.3 billion, health costs, crops, fisheries. Water shortages and their impact on industry, sort of forcing industry to close down, $14 billion. And just with the Yellow River alone, this just came out, this isn't in my book, but I thought it was a good illustration. They said that crop loss from polluted water totaled $3.3 billion, health costs were $2.5 billion, and the river as an ecosystem has lost 1/3 of the ecosystem over the past 10 years. A second issue that I think the environment has had and is having an important impact on is migration. And this emerges not only in terms of the kind of forced migration that you've all read about, with the Three Gorges Dam, or what's going to take place with the South to North Water Transfer Project, but also in terms of larger scale migration because of degraded land and lack of access to water. And some Western and Chinese analysts did a study a few years back that predicted that between 2000 and 2020, 20 to 30 million people would have to migrate for environmental causes. And I think most of you know, thus far migrant workers have integrated with relative ease into all of the coastal communities. But I think if there were a serious hiccup in the Chinese economy, for example, you could see that there might be some conflict or some more difficulties developing as a result. Perhaps the most troubling social problem that has arisen as a result of China's environmental practices, however, is the impact on public health. And I haven't seen any sort of truly great comprehensive studies on this, but just some of the numbers that have emerged are fairly striking. For example, 300,000 people in China died prematurely from air pollution not related to smoking. There are entire riverside communities where the rates of tumors and cancer and stunted growth, diminished IQs are much higher than the norm because of polluted water or contaminated soil. There was even a study that was done not too long ago, but a very preliminary study that involved the World Bank that said that the impact of SARS may be heightened in areas that experience severe air pollution. I haven't seen this confirmed or anything, but I do think that it points at the potential very serious relationship between environmental problems and public health. And finally, of course, there is the issue of social unrest. And about in 1997, I think it was, the Central Committee issued a report that said that environmental causes were one of the 4 major sources of social unrest in the country. And you can read about protests with relative frequency. Farmers who don't have access to enough water for their fields, for their crops, trying to illegally to gain access to a local river, engage in a battle for 2 days with the local police. Or when factories are polluting and the local communities try to report it to the Environmental Protection Bureaus, no action is taken, and then they end up storming the factories and violence ensues. With all of this, I guess the next question really is, what is the government doing about it? And as I was researching the book, it occurred to me, and looking at how the government seemed to be responding, it occurred to me that really what the government has done, what Beijing has done, is simply to emulate what it's done in its process of economic reform. That is to say, it wants a small, elite, highly talented central bureaucracy to devolve authority down to local officials, down to governors or to mayors, to look outside to the international community for assistance, both in terms of policy approaches and in terms of financial assistance, and to invite participation by private actors, in this case, non-governmental organizations, individual activists, and the media, although the media is not quite a private actor. This has worked, of course, very well in many respects in terms of the economy. I'm not sure it's worked quite as well in terms of meeting China's environmental challenges. China indeed does have a small, very qualified central environmental protection administration. People there, you spend 5 minutes talking with them and you can see that they are highly committed and very bright and very eager to address the problems that their country is confronting. Unfortunately, there are only 300 of them in the State Environmental Protection Administration in Beijing. I actually wrote a paper that mentioned this fact, and the reviewer said, this can't possibly be true. And it just happened that Xie Zhenhua, the head of the State Environmental Protection Administration, was coming to visit, and I couldn't make it down to Washington to the meeting, but Jennifer asked him for me, and he said, no, not 300, 270. So I know that this wasn't just a function. He told me this number in 1998. So if he's right that it's now 270, I guess the situation's only gotten worse. China invests about 1.3% of its GDP to environmental protection. I mean, that's the official figure. It's very difficult to understand exactly, how that money is being spent, but that's the number that's out there. I think perhaps more important for understanding the reality of it, it just was a statement issued that's saying that this year the government is falling $9 billion short in terms of meeting its goals for the 10th five-year plan in terms of environmental protection. Chinese environmental scientists themselves say that China should be investing at least 2.2% of GDP merely to keep the situation from getting worse. So if the central bureaucracy is somewhat hampered by lack of people and lack of funds, Beijing has really put an enormous responsibility on local officials. And what this has done is, again, quite similar. The result is quite similar to what you see in terms of economic reform, I think, and that is to produce a patchwork quilt of environmental protection. You have some areas that are wealthy, that have strong ties to the international community, and most importantly, where the mayors or the governors are proactive and have taken the environment as an issue that is either personally important to them or an issue which they view as important because they think it's going to mean advancements. But these areas have done quite well. So Shanghai has witnessed some improvement some significant improvement over the past years. Dalian, Xiamen, some of the coastal cities, they're investing in their own local resources between 3 and 5% of their own revenues into environmental protection. Now this is, as opposed to a place like Sichuan, which is investing around 1%. But just to show the importance of the mayor, Guangzhou was really doing a fairly poor job of addressing its environmental problems. I think quite recently, in the past 2 years, it started to take a new initiative. There's a new mayor who seems more interested. But Guangzhou is quite a wealthy city, but really the mayor wasn't interested. And I think that points up the difference again between a Shanghai and a Guangzhou. And Environmental Protection Bureau officials certainly say that one of the most important factors for them in terms of whether they're able to do their job, whether there's someone who will go to bat for them as they're trying to say, well, we have to find this factory, or we have to shut down this polluting enterprise, even if it means putting people out of work, because these officials come under enormous pressure, of course, not to do that, enormous political pressure not to do that, that what they depend on is support from the mayor. And when they have that, their job is obviously much easier. In terms of the international community, China has been, I think, extraordinarily successful in terms of tapping into the international community, both for financial and intellectual assistance. International governmental organizations such as the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, the Global Environmental Facility, well, Japan, which is a country, not an IGO, but have routinely provided most of their environmental aid to China. International non-governmental organizations are very involved in China on issues ranging from biodiversity protection to tradable permits for SO2, setting energy efficiency standards to training lawyers. So the international community has taken a very strong interest in assisting China. And events also international events tend to spark a new thought process among China's leaders with regard to the environment. So you can see that in the wake of the United Nations Conference on Human Environment in 1972, for example, that helped to spur China to develop its environmental protection bureaucracy, as it did for many countries. In 1992, you had the United Nations Conference on Environmental Development, which contributed to persuade the Chinese government that they ought to allow for environmental NGOs, because some people within the Chinese government were embarrassed by the fact that at this conference, at which NGO participation was so high from around the world, they didn't have real NGOs that could sit at the table. And now we see with the Olympics that has sparked a lot of discussion, at least within Beijing. It's unclear to me what kind of impact the Olympics may have beyond Beijing. But in terms of Beijing, trying to develop alternative fuel vehicles, a fleet of buses and taxis in advance of the Olympics, and greening the city, and moving a lot of the polluting enterprises outside the city limits, and in fact shipping them to other provinces in some cases. So the international community has played a very important role, and I'm just giving you a very small picture of that. I think the impact has been profound, in fact. But I think the most exciting thing that's really emerged over the past decade has been the development of civil society in China and the role of environmental non-governmental organizations. As I mentioned, the first formal environmental NGO was founded in 1994 by a man whom many of you probably know, Yang Songjie, who founded Friends of Nature. And at that time, NGOs, I should say now, started with 3 people sitting around a table, and now has more than 1,000 members, and many of the members have gone off to other parts of the country to start their own NGOs. But at that time, really, the NGOs were focused primarily on environmental education, biodiversity protection, issues that were considered, relatively speaking, more politically safe. You began to see some evolution in the late 1990s. There was sort of lobbying at the top levels, saying, individuals within the NGO movement would say things like, we really need to include the State Environmental Protection Administration in this program, but very sort of subtle kinds of lobbying efforts. And now, this year, 2003, 2004, we've really had an explosion, I think. There have been already 2 cases where local officials have brought dams to a halt because of the role of NGOs mobilizing scientists, NGOs, and the public through these amazing internet campaigns to protest these dams. And in the most famous one, the Nujiang Wan Jiabao himself became involved. So this evolution of the environmental NGOs, I think, and the way that they do business has been extraordinary. There's also been, I think, a really interesting development in terms of the role of individual activists, people who are not affiliated with any NGO, but simply see something that strikes them as off and decide to take action. In my book, I talk about one person that I met, Deng Haiying, who was a doctor in Dalian, and saw a television program about battery recycling in Germany. China actually does an excellent program, not to go too far off track, but China does an excellent job in terms of media work on the environment, I should say. But then she watched a program on battery recycling in Germany and became concerned that her daughter's, 3-year-old daughter's fruits and vegetables were contaminated by the battery dump leaking into the soil near her home. And so she decided to do something about it. And she went to some department stores and said, first she went to the local Environmental Protection Bureau, I should say, which said that, well, we don't have any formal laws on the books. We won't stop you, but we can't help you. So she went to 3 department stores and said, do you think you might be willing just to have these boxes, these big boxes sitting outside your department store, and we'll use these as a repository for batteries. And first they all thought that she was just trying to do some kind of financial scam, trying to make some money. But one of them said okay, and this started an entire battery recycling campaign in Dalian. And a few months later, there was actually laws were passed, and it became a more formalized process to the point that there were reports in the press about environmental protection bureaus complaining about battery phobia, because so many people were calling the local environmental protection bureaus to find out what they should do with their batteries, and they didn't have the capacity to deal with all the batteries that people wanted to bring in. So again, I take that as a very positive sign for what's transpiring on the ground in China. One caveat to that, of course, is that the government continues to maintain a lot of restrictions on environmental NGOs. It is not ignorant of the role that environmental NGOs played in some of the former republics of the Soviet Union or in Eastern Europe in terms of being at the sort of vanguard of democratic change in those countries. And so it has lots of rules and regulations, like you can't have branches of environmental NGOs in different provinces. Or you have to register with a government agency, and that agency has to be responsible for monitoring your membership list and your funding and your activities. And in fact, there was a case not that long ago where an NGO, a prominent NGO, was told that it would have to shut down if it didn't boot off one of its founding board members, and because he'd been active in protesting the planned execution of some Tibetan monks. And over his objections, the NGO pushed him out. Nonetheless, I think it bears noting that a lot of the environmental activists in China today, a number of them, have in them, some of them came to environmental protection out of the belief that this would be a way to advance democracy. Some of them participated in Tiananmen, some of them participated in 1986 demonstrations after Hu Yaobang died. There were all sorts of, sort of democracy roots. And some of them have become convinced through their work on the environment that in fact democracy is necessary. So I think there is a strong strain among some of them, this is not all of them, but among some of them in terms of believing that the environment is a way to advance the cause of broader political reform in the country. Okay, so I know my time is coming up, so I'll just finish up with a couple last comments. So Jennifer said that my book was dark, grim, what was the word you used? Something like that?
There are sad
Sad
things in the book that can end,
okay.
The title.
Right. No, the title's definitely dark, and the picture is dark. But let me say that I think I am well, optimistic is too strong a word. Cautiously optimistic is something I hate to say. I'll just say that I think the Chinese are facing an uphill battle. I think there are positive signs, as I've noted. But I think that there needs to be, I think the model that China has used for economic reform is probably not the most appropriate for environmental protection. and we can talk about why that is if you like in question and answers. And let me just finish by saying a couple of things about why I think this matters to us. I think most of you here in this audience will know already, of course, that China is a major contributor to all global environmental challenges. Second largest contributor to global climate change, ozone depletion, biodiversity loss. So what China does domestically really does matter to the rest of the world. But I think beyond that, what's important to understand, and what I hope comes out in the book, is really that for anybody that wants to understand what China is going to look like in a decade or two from now, you have to understand what China is doing with its environment, because this environment is really shaping the opportunities and constraints that the country has for continued economic development and for the social welfare of its people. Let me end on that note, and thank you.
Well, thank you. I guess I should have kind of said it was sobering.
Yeah.
It's a sobering book. Okay, I will take questions, and please, when you ask a question, just say your name and affiliation so she knows who she's talking to. Okay, gentleman right there.
Glenn Prickett with Conservation International, and thanks both for the book and for that really terrific presentation. You made, I think, a really important point early in your talk when you said that in spite of the national political commitment to the environment, when it gets down to a local level, government officials typically don't see much of a choice between economic or political dislocation or instability on the one hand and environmental protection on the other. And that seems to me to be very true. I'm wondering if in your research you saw any scenarios in which the environment becomes a material factor in either economic stability or political stability to the point where it tips that balance. And could it be water, depletion of water resources? Could it be the emergence of social society? I mean, are you hopeful that environment might actually become a higher priority, or will it continue to take a back seat to political and economic imperatives?
No, I think that's absolutely right. And there are a number of instances in which environmental pressures have led local governments to change their policies, at least for the short term. For example, in Dalian in 2001, in the summer, they had severe water shortages and raised the price of water 10 times. In Beijing, they raised the price of water once in the late 1990s, and again just this past year announced a fairly significant price hike. It's still not to the point of the water replacement cost, but again it was a significant increase. It's a tricky problem. In another case, in Foshan, not too far from Guangdong, there was a few years back, in 2000 I think it was, the local government tried to raise the price of water, but it produced such a firestorm within the local People's Congress that they didn't. They retrenched because they were concerned about social instability. What I've also found, for example, in Jiangsu, which is part of that Huai River Valley area, they tried something sort of innovative, which was to charge different consumers different prices, and in fact to look at areas that were relatively poor, relatively wealthier, and sort of assess water costs on that basis. So there are lots of different ways that different actors, the Asian Development Bank was involved in a project, similar to this, charging different prices to different consumers. Lots of different ways that this is played out. But I guess part of the problem is that there's not really one overall coherent approach to any of this, and so even when you have national policies, you find out that local implementation varies so widely. It really does become an issue of how a local area is able to respond. But in points of severe crisis, they do tend to take the right action.
In the back, Brian.
Hi, thanks. Hi, Brian Lomar, U.S. Department of Agriculture Economic Research Service. Is this loud or is it just me? I'll talk. Again, I really appreciate the book, and this is my question's a nice segue off, or your question is a segue into mine. Keeping in the spirit of optimism here, I'm wondering if in your research you came across any examples of industries or enterprises that, instead of having to be shut down, embraced environmental or decided to conform to environmental laws and adopted technologies or manufacturing practices that reduce their emissions, and therefore became strong advocates of the environmental constituency, I'd imagine.
Well, I encountered at least one that was sued and by the local Environmental Protection Bureau and then took action. I'm trying to think. I can't really think of any local industries that were that proactive. International multinationals, in some cases, have been fairly proactive. For example, surprisingly maybe, Shell has done some really good work in advance, it hopes, of signing a contract for the west to east natural gas pipeline. And they've had some other problems in southern China, but in this particular project, they undertook a big environmental impact assessment that caused the pipeline to be rerouted in the planning stages. And they did a social impact assessment, went and interviewed people all along the pipeline to try to understand what their needs were. They've done a lot of work to think about how, because the pipeline is basically extractive and the money isn't going to go to the Uyghurs in Xinjiang, they've done a lot of work to try to think through how they can ensure that some of the profits, if they in fact make any profits, will go back to the Uyghurs. So I've seen that kind of thing, but off the top of my head, without pressure from local environmental protection bureaus, without or incentives from the international community, financial incentives, I can't really think of one off the top of my head.
Well, one thing that comes to mind is that I have had a few, State Department brings over international, visitor program, and I've had a couple folks that have been, I think it was from Jiangsu, that they're trying to create some, there are special economic zones, for tax-free to attract international and also local businesses. And there were a few people who told me they're trying to create these green special economic zones. And that's one of the, I want to investigate that question. The other one comment, again, this feeds into Liz's point about the international community being a catalyst. The World Business Council on Sustainable Development had a press release a couple months ago that they're helping the Chinese form their own branch office, and that to help inspire corporate social responsibility. And I'm talking to them, and I'm getting, the office will be open at the end of the month, and I hope to meet them when I go to China. So if you're interested, Brian, I'll let you know. But I think it is a sector that's a wee bit behind the curve. Yeah. Okay, another question. Baruch, and then the gentleman in the back.
Baruch Boxer, Resources for the Future. Liz, I was wondering whether anything was learned in the context of the failure of the Huai program, really, about the ultimate effectiveness of a governor level, trans-provincial commission, which was, I think, the first one to be set up in China, to try to get people, people who are governors or vice governors from different provinces to look at a problem, and deal with it. Was there any follow-up to this, or did that commission just die? Or are they did they admit they learned anything from their failures, or what?
The commission that was set up, there was one that was set up as early as the 1970s to look at this issue. The problem was they couldn't get any agreement among the 4 provinces that were involved. And then in 2000, I guess the World Bank had been promising them money, and then they were fighting over the money from the World Bank. I'm not aware of any good takeaway from this. As far as I can tell, each province is mostly pursuing its own independent approaches. At least I know in Jiangsu they're doing their own thing. And I don't think that the South to North Water Transfer Project probably suggests that they've learned a lot about negotiating among provinces in advance before undertaking these massive campaigns.
Gentleman in the far back.
Ken Dillon, Spectrum Bioscience. I wonder if there are any specific environmental medicine initiatives by the official medical establishment, and also are there any informal ones by traditional Chinese medicine?
Well, one thing that comes to mind is that the International Fund for Animal Welfare, and I think also I know that they're working with the Traditional Chinese Medicine Association to try to help them. You know, they've educated a lot of these traditional medicine doctors, and again, this big association about, you know, if you guys use the dragon claw and the bear claw and all this thing, that it's hurting the animals, and so the Traditional Chinese Medicine Association has sought alternatives to some of these, and also among its membership said, you know, nix the bear, own the bear bile and all that nasty stuff. And so, yeah, so again, some international organizations, but also some Chinese environmental groups have joined in with this, being a safe area. That's the first thing that comes to mind.
Yeah, if that's what you're talking about, though, I think that that's not. I didn't think so. I couldn't quite understand what you were talking about, but had it been that, I would have. So if you could be a little more specific, then.
Any ways of prophylaxis or of treatment of respiratory disorders and so on?
Oh, from
environmental toxic substances.
Oh.
Are you familiar with any
I'm
of these
not.
programs?
No, I'm not.
There is actually, I mean, what I've noticed is that there are like some health NGOs, and something that I'm not seeing is that the health NGOs aren't really talking to the environmental NGOs right now. So your point, you've identified a gap, sir. Gentleman in the far back, and then, okay. Gotcha.
Albert Shea, American University. This is also about respiratory problems. The comment that you were wondering about with air pollution aggravating SARS cases actually is quite credible, because one of the important treatments that is used is heavy doses with anti-inflammatory steroids to suppress, you know, runaway inflammatory response and pulmonary edema. So anything that would aggravate inflammatory response, such as air pollutants, would clearly exacerbate the problem.
Thanks.
Good. Confirmation. Okay, and the woman right here in the polka dots?
I'm Kati Lofler. I work with the Smithsonian National Zoo, and I've spent a significant amount of time in China recently with my own work, and one of the things that strikes me, not just in China, but very much so in the United States and everywhere else, that so much of the environmental reform has to really come from what, you know, we kind of call a grassroots level. So changing behavior of individuals, which essentially means changing a culture. And this is one of the things that I find so overwhelming in China, that the behavior of people, I mean, especially with regard to animals, because that's what I work with, but also in their own immediate environment even. It seems like there so much change would have to take place in just the culture and personal habits and things like this that would then really be able to spread out and engender a more widespread environmental change. So it seems to me that that would be a very significant element of environmental change, and not just looking for the government and NGOs and everything from kind of the top down and outside to come in and fix it. What are your thoughts or observations about that? Right.
I mean, there's no doubt that the task can appear overwhelming when you approach it that way. But I think there is some truth. You know, Ronald Englehart from the University of Michigan did a lot of surveys, you know, sort of surveys of values. And one of the things that he concluded over decades of doing this kind of work was that as areas become wealthier, they do tend to place more importance on things like environmental protection. And I think by and large, you do see this happening in China today. And you find people that are interested in organic farming, and they want, you know, organic vegetables and things like, once they can afford them, that's what they want. And even if they can't afford them, people are concerned. Or you find, as I mentioned, that doctor who had the individual initiative to do this kind of thing. But I think there has to be some involvement from NGOs and the government, because that's where the education is going to come from to begin with. And as I mentioned, they really put forth a lot of effort, and at least in the major cities, you know, in schools, there's a lot of environmental education. The Ministry of Education is very interested in developing environmental curriculum. NGOs have, you know, Liang Fengjia has a van that goes out and traverses into the, you know, far reaches of the country and develops curriculum and sort of programs specifically designed for that very region. So they go into Inner Mongolia may talk about the problems of desertification or of, herders, this kind of thing, lack of water, what do you do? So it is a change in mindset, a change in culture, but many countries have experienced that. It's just that in China, with 1.3 billion people, it does seem overwhelming at times.
First, man in blue, and then you. I counted in order. Yes.
Alulu from Energy Information Administration. You mentioned that China will be the largest car market in 2013.
Second largest.
Second. I'm wondering what is your source and what will be the implication?
The source is the Financial Times, and it was actually the head of Chrysler that predicted that. And the implication, I think, is huge for air pollution primarily, and from getting from one place to the next in any city that you may be. I mean, already in Beijing, again, you can feel the difference. And I didn't go to China last year because of SARS, but the year before, there's been an enormous increase, in the cars. And again, despite all the efforts that Beijing is supposedly making to move its polluting enterprises outside the city limits to develop these alternative, vehicle fleet in time for the Olympics, I really felt as though the air pollution was worse than I had remembered it. So for me, that's the most important implication of China's growing car market. I mean, of course, there are implications for the oil, market too, international oil prices, I suppose, this kind of thing. But I guess maybe, there was a lot of hope, I think, a decade ago that China was going to get it right and was not going to follow the United States in terms of its development path. But from what I've seen, quite frankly, it's doing exactly what the United States has done, and hasn't made any sort of real leapfrog the way that people were talking about, even in terms of developing mass transit. I knew some people that were involved in trying to figure out, the best way for Shanghai, just to develop its highway systems for buses and where you would locate, large shopping centers, this kind of thing, and none of that came to pass. So, I'm willing to be proved wrong, but to date, I think that there's the same kind of attitude of we develop, we pollute, then we redress, and that there can be a scientific fix to any problem that's created.
Okay, gentlemen.
I'm Rob Taylor from International Center for Journalists, and for obvious reasons, I'm interested in you expanding on your views of the media. I think you said that you thought the media was doing a good job of reporting on environmental problems. Please tell us more about that, and tell us what kind of impact media are having in cities like Guangdong that you said were not making the kinds of steps that Shanghai, for instance, had made.
Right. Yeah, I think the media is one of the most exciting areas to be involved in environmental protection. You see it not only in terms of newspaper reporting, but also in terms of television. There are a lot of television programs that deal with environmental issues. People line up outside television studios to ask reporters to go and investigate a local polluting factory, and they do. In November, in fact, a reporter from CCTV was attacked by factory workers because he was going there to investigate, and then the local Environmental Protection Bureau came in to his rescue. But they are responsible. They bring a lot of pressure to bear. If a local factory manager all of a sudden sees his face on TV, it brings a lot of pressure to bear on him and that factory. So I think, one, in terms of uncovering pollution violations that way, or at least highlighting them, they're doing an interesting job. But also really just in terms of environmental education. I mean, frankly, I can't think of the last time I saw a program on battery recycling in Germany. Yao Xiaoli, who is one of the earliest, Sherry Liao, one of the earliest environmental activists in China, along with Yang Congjian, has a television program that she's been running for probably close to a decade now, called Time, A Minute in Time. Let me remember the name of it. Something, I can't quite remember the name, but
Was it? Green Space.
Oh, Green Space? Oh, she must have changed it then. Okay, yeah, must have changed the name. But she was doing a special in preparation for the Johannesburg summit looking at the way that middle-sized farms in the United States, how they run their farms to make them productive and at the same time environmentally friendly, to show a 10 program series on this issue to air on television. So I think there's a lot of environmental education going on through the media.
What is not permissible? Criticism of federal, central government policy?
Yeah, that's I think one of the things that's happening now in China today, not just in terms of the environment, but more broadly, is that the line is quite blurred, and that it's never quite clear when you've crossed that line. Look, Liao Xiaoli, again, the same woman that I mentioned, came out and criticized quite publicly the Go West campaign. Right? This is one of China's major initiatives announced in 1999 to develop the interior provinces of the country. And one of the 5 major tenets of the campaign was supposed to be ecological construction, environmental protection. And but the State Environmental Protection Administration wasn't included in the leading groups. There was a lot of money that was supposedly designated, but she came out and she said in the media, in the press, basically, how can we be sure that all of this money is not simply going to be siphoned off? That corruption basically isn't going to account for all of this. Did they ask us, the NGOs, for our input? No. So, she did it, and she's just fine. I saw her 2 weeks ago, no problems. But at a different point in time, under a different set of circumstances, I think that kind of statement might have been blacked out, or she might have gotten in some kind of trouble for it.
If I can add, I've had some journalists here speaking, and one thing that at one meeting they talked about, they said, well, what we do is we overstep the line and get flat back, and then just are good for a little while, and then we do it again. And so that they know how to work the system. I mean, they're part of the system, and so it's this great song and dance routine. But they definitely are. They're very activist news media. The environmental journalists are very activist. So they're not, they admit, I'm not biased, I'm for the environment. I have time for just a couple more quick questions, so keep the questions short so we can get a couple in.
Actually, afterwards I'll talk to you. I saw a similar program, this is a response to the gentleman from EIA that cited the same statistic about car growth in China. And there were some Harvard professors, and they also had gone and interviewed a couple in China. It was very moving. They'd moved to Beijing, and the husband does documentaries, and one of which was to try and save a certain brand of endangered monkey. But they felt they had to buy a car because it wasn't safe to ride a bike and have the 4-year-old daughter on the back of the bike with the traffic the way it was now in Beijing. And my quick question for you is, I wonder if you've given any thought to the future of nuclear power in China as a solution to the greenhouse gas problem. I know it's very controversial in the United States. It's more accepted in France. I wonder if you have an opinion.
Yeah, the Chinese have talked about developing the nuclear power industry for more than, for 15 years. This has at least been on the plate, at least since, global climate change was on the radar screen. They started talking about, nuclear power. It's been very slow to develop in China. And in part, I think, because of the costs. There haven't been any real sort of social protests in China. There's not, as far as I know, a lot of attention being paid among non-governmental organizations toward this issue. Hong Kong and NGOs have been, active on this issue. But in the mainland, it really hasn't become an issue. I would imagine that if all of a sudden you started seeing a lot of investment in a lot of nuclear power plants under construction, it might provoke some additional discussion about where are we going to store this nuclear waste, what are we doing, what are the safety issues. I think that China is ready to have that debate within the population, within civil society. But again, I think there's a lot of discussion. We just tried to get them to buy our technology recently, and I think in the most recent meeting, maybe it was Cheney's meeting, I think that was on the docket for him. But the Europeans are, the French are there and trying to develop. But again, it's been very slow to develop.
Okay, maybe do you have a quick question here? Sure.
This would be Bruce.
Bruce.
I'm Bruce Dixon from GW. You mentioned that local governments are not really active at enforcing environmental laws, but they do go after some polluters. And so I'm wondering why, or how do they pick their targets? Are they softer on state firms but tougher on private ones? Do they go after the worst polluters or just the easiest targets? How does they sort of pick or zero in on?
Yeah, it really varies by region. It's quite interesting. There have been some studies done, some very intensive studies done, and that have shown that, for example, in Chongqing, they have found it especially difficult to go after the big state-owned enterprises. And in other areas, it's harder where there aren't as many big state-owned enterprises to go after the local ones because they're the ones that are employing all the people in the town. So I don't think that there's any definitive evidence about which one is easier to attack than the other. I think there, for a long time, was a sense that it was easier to regulate the state-owned enterprises than the smaller township and village enterprises. State-owned enterprises have, or used to have, little environmental protection departments within the enterprise, and you could at least work with them quite directly. Township and village enterprises are, again, much smaller, much more difficult to track and to regulate. SOEs were responsible for providing pollution information. Whether or not that was accurate or whether it was actually provided is a different question, but there was, at least on the books, some form of accounting for this. But I think in general, it's exceedingly difficult, and the Environmental Protection Administration officials will say exceedingly difficult to track the small-scale enterprises, because in many instances, even if they're not operating during the day, sometimes they'll just operate at night, or they'll use their pollution abatement facilities when inspections come, and then just don't use them when they're not. So it's really quite a difficult scenario. But I think shorter answer to your question is it really just depends on the economics of the issue.
And I actually think, Bruce, you were a closing pitcher question there. Because, hey, there's a reception out there. But before we applaud and all that good stuff, I do want to acknowledge and thank the Council on Foreign Relations, John and his colleagues that helped me set this up and in co-sponsoring this event. And I want to thank all of you. My goodness, a lot of you came and asked very intelligent questions. So please, let's thank our speakers. And we have a reception out front, and then you have permission to tackle her with more questions.
Thank you. Great. Yeah, had a lot of fun.
They were good questions.
They were good questions. Yeah, I thought they'd be good here in the States.
I thought I didn't.
No, I'm not.
Where I am.
Hey, I just recommend foreign affairs. I don't know what to do with it. Process? Okay, great. You sent it to me. Really fun, actually.
It's great. It's really, I was actually in the Council for Relations, they have these study groups, and I was in
that right? You added your name for,
Did you give you my publication? But you should have your own number.
What are you doing? I think she looks so good.
She was a first speaker. Yeah, it's not. I'm buying. I'm going to buy a few copies for people. I mean, it's very. Again, it is dark, but it's sobering, and I think that's. I had a journalist call me, and actually living on Earth. They wanted to do a story. So, I talked about what I'm doing, and then I recommended the economy to their
No, you have to wait a second because. Yeah, would you?
I'm not sure. I came in the stage door.
Okay.
Okay.
That would have been an important
Really, I mean, I think it's just Andrew says, I had a pretty frank conversation with Franklin about the SAID in China, in New York. No, but I think on my understanding, history, I think it's good to sort of press Franklin as to what's the history of the change. That's what Franklin said.
But on the other hand, several countries have taken China out from the AID.
I don't know the current politics, but when I was there, we tried a couple of times to get an NSC waiver for one little USIC program. Although you can argue that I was always in favor of that.
Yeah, I can tell you, sitting in China working with the city, legally, captured in that other little publication, with the business folks that kind of saying was really inhibited because they have no support mechanisms like the country because they're not running that out. And that was one of the main discussion points, obviously, good going.
But you do have a huge World Bank program, so if the U.S. wanted to, they could step up their oversight.
Right, yeah.
Can't keep up with you.